Thank you so much for the reminder, and thanks everyone for agreeing that. So like I was saying, really briefly, what we're really, I think, interested in here is using debt as a way to analyze the way that racial, colonial, imperial capitalism works, and also how we can use debt to build power to strike against the racial, colonial, capitalist system. And one of the things that we're excited to learn about and study about collectively is this connection between war and debt. And so we already had a session on the ways in which the Ukraine war is deeply impacted by different debt realities for Ukraine, the IMF, World Bank, and other countries. And now we're happy to have Sofya here, who's going to talk about some of the military recruitment techniques, the ways that military recruitment has happened historically and in the present, how that's related to debt. We'll close out the War and Debt series with a presentation from Nazia Kazi about different ways that some of our wars are debt funded and how they depend on debt in order to build this military machine as well. I think that's all I'm going to say about Jubilee School. We are going to structure this where Sofya gives a presentation. We have some time for question and answer. Feel free at any moment to hop in with questions or comments. And one way to also make comments is to include the word stack in the chat, and that way I can keep track of who wants to say something. You can also raise your hand or make a signal and I'll try and catch it. So without further ado, Sofya, thanks so much and take it away.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks for everyone for coming. I'm Sofya Aptekar. I teach at the School of Labor and Urban Studies at the City University of New York, CUNY. Yeah, I am going to share my screen and talk a bit about the U.S. military and empire. And I'm going to say that it's largely based on research that I did for a book of mine that came out last month or 2 months ago now. But you know, I didn't write directly about debt, but I used this opportunity participating in the Jubilee School kind of to think through the research that I did through the lens of debt. And that was incredibly helpful and productive for me because, as it turned out, debt was so much part of the story, like even when I was not directly talking about debt. And I think, to me, that's also indicative of just how debt is, you know, everywhere in so many of the social structures and processes that we're a part of. And part of our work is surfacing it and making this conversation explicit. So if you bear with me, I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides, and I'm going to talk for a bit, but definitely going to have plenty of time for a discussion. And I really want to hear from all of you in the room. So please share your thoughts and feel free to interrupt. All right, green card soldiers, empire, and debt. So as I mentioned, I have this new book, The Green Card Soldier, Between Model, Immigrant, and Security Threat. And although the book is focused on immigrants in the United States military, there's a lot in it about the military more general that I'm going to pull on today. So I'm going to talk about the cycle of debt in the military. And that, you know, from the time that people enlist in the military and start thinking about possibly joining up, that can play a huge role. And that's kind of easier to think about, especially for those of us who work with student debt abolition. But debt actually, I call it a cycle, it continues to affect military workers' lives while they're in the military. And yet it continues even after they separate from the military. So veterans then face other forms of debt burdens and the consequences of debt. So I'm just going to kind of trace all of these ways that different types of debts too, student debt, but not exclusively, affect people as they move through the military and out of the military. And in the last part, I'm going to zoom out a little bit and take a more global perspective, discussing the role of debt in maintaining U.S. empire. So first kind of a more individual institutional focus and then big picture, the whole globe. So let me start with the cycle of debt in the military. So debt can play a very important role in enlistment. I'm going to start with something that's, of course, really central to the work of the Debt Collective, which is abolishing college loans and debt that people have from paying for college. It's a major reason why people enlist. The military today is in its worst recruitment crisis in the last 25 years, which we should celebrate. And it's spending a ton of resources trying to entice young people to join. And it also does a lot of research to find out, what kind of factors push youth to enlist. And in their own research, their polls consistently show that among youth in the United States, paying for college is a top reason, top consideration when thinking about the possibility of joining the military. And I can share the link for this poll so you can check it out yourself. And of course, there's a classic tweet from the Debt Collective, and there are tons of other headlines I could have shared, where we see kind of the military itself, and certainly like commentators, making a connection between debt abolition, abolishing student debt, and what will it do for military recruitment. And so if we take away this reason that pushes so many of our young people into the military, how will we get anyone to enlist, right? Constant kind of worry. So the military, of course, then is not a fan of debt cancellation or abolition. And this is part of what critics of the military call the poverty draft, which is basically the idea that even though we no longer have an actual military draft since 1973, since the Vietnam War, people are pushed to enlist in the military by economic forces, so hence the poverty draft. Incidentally, like another thing the military really dislikes is raising the minimum wage. So when minimum wage went up in cities like Seattle, in New York, to more than the federal minimum wage, that is also like a huge threat to recruit. And I wanted to share, my book is interview based. I talked to 72 immigrants who enlisted in US military. And so I wanted to give you a sense of what my conversations with them were like. So here's a quote from one of the folks that I talked to, whom I call Brian, it's not his real name, but he immigrated from Canada as a teenager. So he went to high school in the US. And I asked him to talk about like how he came to be in the Army. And he said, I'm really against going into a lot of debt. And I couldn't see going to college as something that was feasible for me to do without going into debt. And so that was something that kept me from attending. Some of the schools, especially Pennsylvania State University with $19,000 of tuition a year, was just overwhelming for me to think like that's going to be a debt that I have to pay off. I don't think so. I don't think I could do that. And so after some years after high school, where he was working factory jobs, he ended up enlisting with kind of college debt in mind. And I should point out that while, yes, the military will pay for college if you're in it, or if you're a veteran, it is very possible, and it happens all the time, that people have student debt anyway, because the programs that provide college tuition for people in the military have a lot of rules and conditions. For example, you have to take a minimal number of classes a semester, which not everybody could do, and they will not pay for you to repeat a class you fail. So I was just talking last week to a friend of mine who is a veteran, and she was telling me about her student debt, and I was like, wait, how? And she had $5,000 of student debt that she said was mostly interest rates, and it was from things like that. So there's the promise of college being paid, but it's not even always real. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. Sorry, here it is. So not being able to pay for college is a major reason for enlistment, but people also enlist after they graduate from college because they graduate and they have a bunch of student debt and they have trouble finding a job. So I talked to people who were in that situation, particularly those who left college during the Great Recession. So there were a lot of stories that, like they did go to college, they got their degree, and then like they were facing paying off this debt and they couldn't find a job that would be enough, and then they joined the military. So that also happens, and I think especially in kind of the times in the economy when it's more difficult to find jobs. If you are discharged from the military with a total and permanent disability discharge, which is a type of discharge if you're disabled by your service, the government won't make you pay back your student loans, but like just the student loans that you have, whether or not you have it through the military service or not. And while you're in the military, your interest rates are capped at 6% for all your loans. So for some people like that, that could be something that's attractive and that they consider when thinking about enlistment. Working for the military also opens up access to VA guaranteed home loans. And there's a huge industry built up around these types of loans. Just like there's a lot of marketing of college education to veterans, encouraging them and service members, encouraging them to use their benefits, particularly from for-profit colleges. So all in all, the debt can be a factor in pushing people to enlist, whether it's the fear of acquiring debt or dealing with the debt one already has. And since my book is about immigrants, I'm going to say a little bit about how there can be an immigrant twist on the story of debt and enlistment. First of all, to just go over the basics, immigrants, including those who are not US citizens, have always served in the US military since the beginning of the United States. And here are some figures on just like how many people we're talking about in recent years. So there's about 5,000 non-citizens enlisting every year, 25,000 non-citizens in the military now, and there are more than 500,000 foreign-born veterans. So this is not trivial numbers. And I'm pointing out the non-citizens because, of course, you can also be an immigrant and be a US citizen because you're naturalized, because all of these people are vulnerable to deportation despite being veterans. And that can also have a debt component in the story, as it turns out. So immigrants are driven into enlistment by some of the same things as non-immigrants, but there are a few additional factors to consider. So often immigrants have loved ones that have debt, or they themselves might be in that situation, that stems from the criminalization of immigration and the militarization of US borders. So the equipment is flowing, like in the last 5 years or so, from Afghanistan to the US-Mexico border. So the border is getting, even more militarized with, all this really fancy equipment that tracks people's movements and so on, and surveils the border. And it makes entering the United States more dangerous, and it also makes it a lot more costly. So it doesn't mean that people stop coming. It's just that they go into a lot more debt to come to the United States. So we have a situation where these migrants are far more indebted. So, someone coming from China, for example, in recent years might be in $80,000 worth of debt to, migration brokers that facilitated their journey, and it will take them, a decade maybe to pay off with interest. So you have immigrants who themselves, or they might have somebody who is in that situation in debt. On top of it, you can have, you have immigration detention and deportation. Unlike in criminal justice system, there's no guaranteed representation in the immigration detention. So if you want to have immigration attorney, which does help, you have to pay for it. And so in some cases, immigrants and their families resort to predatory lending, predatory loans to pay for these attorneys. So there's detention related debt as well, at the end of which, of course, you might be deported anyway, and you still, have these debts. So immigrants can be pushed into enlisting by these types of debts, in their families or among their loved ones. So I talked to one woman from Pakistan who enlisted in the military and chose a really high risk occupation so that she could get a $10,000 enlistment bonus. And that went to pay for the immigration attorney that helped fight her brother's deportation case, because her brother was in immigration detention at that time that she enlisted, and the family just desperately needed the money. So that's kind of an example of like the additional economic factors in debt that might be pushing immigrants to enlist. So that's enlistment, but debt continues to play a role once you're in the military. In many ways, in general, members of the military don't have full civil rights that civilians, at least ostensibly, have. There's no right of free speech or assembly. There's a separate justice system, and there's special punishments for military workers who have excessive debt. So it could be having debt in the military can lead to a bad conduct discharge. When you have this type of discharge from the military, you lose your benefits, right? So this can make it's a huge risk, right? To take, because a lot of people went into the military for those benefits. And then if you have debt, you lose access to them. People with debt can have problems with security clearances. Security clearances are crucial for the advancement of your career in the military. So if you want to not be in kind of lower level, higher risk jobs, then you have to, keep your debt to a manageable level, or you will be denied a security clearance. So people with, with debt, really could run into a lot of problems while they're working for the military. So the situation with debt for military members recently made the news kind of more than normal, with a wave of stories about food insecurity among members of the military, particularly the National Guard, but not exclusively the National Guard either. So what's happening is that these military workers are prioritizing paying off their loans above many other things, including paying for food. Because if they don't pay off these loans, that their careers are threatened, and they're threatened with this bad conduct discharge, which means they lose their benefits and their pay through the military. So there's reports and news stories kind of covering this pretty dire situation, which is also kind of sadly ironic, because the poverty's draft is what bring into the military a lot of times with the hope that they will be able to, buy homes, support their families that they couldn't otherwise. And just like there is a whole, predatory industry getting people to spend their college benefits and their military, buy homes with their VA-backed loans, there's also a huge industry of payday loans just targeted at the military. So this is a quote from something called the Military Wallet that has a lot of advice on money for members of the military that explains why it's important to maintain high credit scores. It says, your credit report is a sign of your trustworthiness. If you will be working with sensitive information, or if you are in a position where you're handling money, the government or another employer wants to know whether or not your poor financial situation would make you vulnerable to bribe attempts. If you have a lot of debt, there's the concern that you would be willing to sell classified or proprietary information, or that you might embezzle the funds you oversee. So that's the reasoning with debt. Again, the immigrant twist that is a bit exacerbated because a lot of immigrants, especially if they're more recent arrivals and they're in the military, they're already in a position where they're constantly having to prove that they're not spies, they're not security threats. Then you add the whole debt level layer on top of it. It's not hard to see how people would prioritize paying off their loans above it, survival things like that. And so we come to veterans. Debt continues to haunt you after you separate from the military. It's quite possible to owe money to the VA. So let me explain how that can happen. So the VA occasionally overpays people and they don't know about it. And then they say, pay it all back right now. When I read about that, I actually could relate because as a union activist in my own union chapter, that happens to my coworkers, graduate workers who get, their paycheck gets messed up by HR and they want the money back immediately, and it's a lot of money, and then they threaten people with fees on top of it. And this VA, of course, is much bigger than my workplace at CUNY, so this happens on a massive scale, and people can't pay it off immediately, and so then they are in debt to the VA. When you owe money to the VA, they will take the debt out of your veterans benefits. They take it out of your disability pay. And you can also fall into debt through the healthcare system, because if you don't pay your co-pays, when you go to the VA for healthcare, they can actually deny you medical services as well. So there's a medical debt story there also. And, I already mentioned immigration detention and deportation. When you have veterans in prison and immigration detention who don't have access to their veterans benefits, as people do not in prison, and certainly not immigration detention, they also don't have access to representation in immigration detention. There is even more risk of predatory loans being used to try to remedy their situation. So let me look at the time. Okay, so the last part, and then I want to move towards discussion, is zooming out a bit, looking at the global picture, and talking about debt and US empire. So to start with, let's take a look at this map for a minute of US bases, military bases across the world. There are a lot. They're in a lot of places. And actually recently I did a talk with anti-war veteran activist Monisha Rios, and she pointed out that this is actually just like the official military bases. But if you broaden the definition to see where there is like people and equipment and so on, it's actually thousands. So this is a very kind of conservative estimate in the map. So in any case, this gives you a scope of the US military across the world. And I think it's also, really important to talk about the costs of war and the devastation wrought by the US military across the world. Like, yes, we have the US military is the larger polluter in the world, the largest contributor to the climate crisis. And just zooming in on the global war on terror, just on Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, according to the Brown University's cost of war project, we're looking at a conservative estimate of civilian casualties of 500,000 people. These wars just in those countries have produced millions of refugees, profound destruction of physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, and the cost of that is the monetary cost of that is the US government has spent $6.5 trillion. So I want us to, keep that in mind, because I started by talking kind of on the individual level about individuals, enlisting and their experiences. This is also, we have to always talk about what the US military does and not separate that part of reality from the more individual level death story. War, and this is important because war and destructions are good for financial elites. They're making money off of it. This is a headline that I recently saw. Morgan Stanley is making money off the war in Ukraine. It's good. It's good for profits. And just like one example to give you a taste of how international debt also plays into it, another kind of debt is we have, in the case of Pakistan, which is crucial to the US wars in the region, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and where the US military has, wreaked havoc in terms of deaths and just destruction of communities. International debt is the lever that the United States is using to gain access to Pakistan's resources, and to get, even more control of the mineral and energy rich region between China and Russia. So how does it do that? The US is a hugely powerful player in the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the strings that are attached to Pakistan's international debt include Pakistan's government's consent to US military presence and use of its resources and its people to further the US imperial project in the region. And also to entrench the power of Pakistan's own military and increase the culture of militarism there. So yet another way that this form of debt is playing a role in US empire and trickles down, to those individual at a level of debts that I started with. Wars create refugees. US military disrupts, destroys communities across the world. Most people, when they're fleeing this destruction and trying to save themselves and their families, they do not come to the United States. They're displaced within their country or they're in their neighboring country. This, by the way, is another way that Pakistan is doing the bidding of the United States because it's hosting millions of refugees from the region. And the small number of people that do make it to the United States, such as, there's, a fraction of what probably should be Afghani translators and collaborators with the US military who are fleeing Afghanistan, then they are viewed as potential military recruits. Like it's already happening. The military sees immigrants in general as having useful cultural and language skills. They call them force multipliers, and there are, enormous efforts to recruit immigrants specifically. But already people are talking about, these Afghan refugees joining the US military and what they can bring to it. And this is, this can be like, whoa, but there's a huge historical precedent there. Communities in general that bear the brunt of US colonialization, Guam, Puerto Rico comes to mind, not to mention citizens of indigenous nations within the current United States borders, they have the highest enlistment rates out of all the groups. And they also have the highest death rates among military workers. Similarly, a disproportionate number of military workers are from the Philippines, a former colony of the United States that has continuing really heavy presence of US military. And so the US continues to wage war on Afghanistan through drone strikes and contractors. And as I mentioned, the equipment from places like Afghanistan is flowing to US-Mexico border, making the crossing of that border more deadly. And again, it costs more to cross the border, people's debts increase, and then we have a cycle of debt that continues that, connects across the globe with different types of debt, from individual to IMF type of debt. And I will end, my conclusion from having had the opportunity to think through this, because being invited to be part of this amazing series, is that migration, military, debt, and empire are all connected. And debt abolition must be anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-capitalism at the same time, or it's not going to work. So here's how to contact me, and I will stop sharing so I can talk to you guys. Thanks.
Round of applause. Sofya, that was really incredible on so many levels, and your analysis is so sharp and so well put together and articulated. Thank you so much for sharing that. Do you mind telling us also where we can get the book? I forgot to mention that.
Oh, thank you. Anywhere the books are sold actually is the answer.
I highly
Please do not buy it on Amazon.
Okay. Maybe
yeah, I'll put a link in. Thank you.
Okay. But that was really so sharp. I'm kind of like, what the fuck? Let's have some questions and comments, some conversation. What are some thoughts that people had, some questions that people had, feelings that people had, anything that you want to share for a dialogue? Dana, please.
All right, so thank you. This is not like a well-formed question, so I'm just gonna get your thoughts on it, but I'm thinking about the Supreme Court decisions from last week. one that struck down student debt cancellation and the other that eliminated affirmative action, except in the case of military colleges. So I'm wondering if there's like alignment or analysis that you could bring to those decisions that might be helpful from your research.
Should I go ahead and answer, Jason?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, thank you, Dana, for asking that. Actually, I've been thinking a lot about it. So as part of my research for the book, I learned that the military has long been a consistent supporter of affirmative action in higher education, which is not obvious. And then there is now, this carve out in the Supreme Court case that destroys affirmative action in highly selective colleges. So what's going on there? Like, how do they think about diversity or affirmative action? So one thing to keep in mind, so these military, and then critics are saying like, well, that affirmative action is okay for military academies, and that means, sending Black and brown youth into the trenches to die is acceptable, but not to go to highly selective colleges. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, because military academies, only about 20% of officers in the US military come through that. And they're, they do experience risk, but they are management. Out of like total casualties, US military casualties, less than 2% are officers. Not less than 2% are from the officers that came through the military academy. So I don't want to overstate like what is happening there. But that's the other piece of the puzzle that's really important, is that most officers do come through ROTC programs or officer training schools after they get a bachelor's degree in the civilian college. And the military looks at like very openly, if you read their amicus brief for the Supreme Court case that just happened, they're very openly like referencing what happened during the Vietnam War, which is like the officers were super white, which is still largely the case. There's not been a lot of progress. And there was racial unrest, and it compromised the effectiveness of the US military to have like, white officers commanding, heavily Black and brown rank and file military workers. They're trying to avoid that from happening as much. And they're also talking about like, even the white officers, we want them to have exposure to people of color because they're going to command people of color. So they need to know how to be around them. That's like openly in the briefs that's supporting the affirmative, like the affirmative action side to preserve. So this carve out for military academies is just like part of what's happening. There's this larger stream of officers that they want not to all be white, and they have not succeeded since the 70s in really diversifying it.
Makes you want to holler. Other questions or comments? Eleni and Manny.
Hey, Sophia, this is really fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. Thanks for coming out and giving us the crash course. I had a question about how the military is how does the military have access to, is the military doing credit checks on people and they're just requesting that panel data, or how are they getting that? Do you know?
That's a good question. I should find that out. Yeah, I mean, credit scores they're doing, but like the military is really in people's lives.
That's
like,
just
part of
what
like
I'm
not
wondering,
having
like,
any rents.
how do they get that information, at what intervals, through what? That's just kind of what, like, if you know anything about that, the piping of that system.
I
my
don't, but I
question.
should
Yeah.
find out. Thank you.
Just curious. Yeah.
Yeah.
Small detail.
But an important one.
Manny?
No, it's just well, I don't even know where to start, in full honesty. Like everything you went over, like to a certain point, I've been connected to. Like I told a lot of people, this high school I went to was considered literally in my very first class at Berkeley was an example of the worst high school in America, and it was my high school in the book. And the one thing I brought up every single time was I've never saw a single college recruiter ever show up to my school, but I had men in military suits I kid you not, Ferraris parked right outside. None of us had ever seen these vehicles. And I have a friend who, to your point about having to return money because they overpaid her, she took out a loan on a brand new Camaro that she was always dreamed of having, and then had like almost $20,000-$30,000 of debt because her VA benefits were saying they paid her out too much, but she couldn't return the money because she'd used it to buy the vehicle. And then like the last point that like really stuck to me was like the imperialism part, just because like one of the things I've been learning is like how debt has been used not only to control populations, but like the way it seems to me is that debt is also being used as the way for nations to keep each other in check, right? So it's like, how much debt do other countries have to America, and how much debt to other countries have to any other country for that matter? And I was reading, I don't know if you know anything about this or have heard about it, but like China is trying to get a bunch of nations to get to, like, they're going to give all kinds of stuff for infrastructure loans and ultimately use that as a way to like empirically control them. I'm just wondering if like you see that anywhere else, or is it just like select nations that are doing this?
Well, I think you see it in Ukraine right now. Yeah, I mean, I think like you're right to highlight this pattern, and like the only thing I would add is it's not necessarily like nations doing it each other. Like we do have to remember how big of a player the US is. It has, you know, the next 10 militaries combined is smaller than the US military, and it's really powerful. Like, so it's not like just, you know, some countries are doing it to other countries. It's largely the US is doing to other countries, and there are other examples as well, but there's a giant in the room that I don't want to like flatten it out and say like everybody's doing it to everybody else. Maybe they would like to, but thank you for sharing those other points too. Like, just exactly.
Phil.
Yeah, hey everyone. Thanks, Sophia, for the research, and really appreciate your looking at your research through the lens of debt. I think that seems to be something the Debt Collective is able to bring and push in the world, just to really bring that lens, as Jason, you said, to analyze and critique racial capitalism, but also build the power to overthrow it. So appreciate you sort of incorporating that into your work this evening. And Manny, I was just thinking about, Manny, what you were saying, just like what's baked into debt, the kind of measures. And Sophia, I thought it was really interesting. You said that the World Bank sort of agreements around debt with countries bakes into it just the military presence of the US in countries. And I don't know, I doubt that there's any other country in the world whose military benefits from World Bank agreements. You know, I think there's a lot of propaganda out there about China. It's really actually, I think, pretty terrifying, the sort of propaganda around China right now, leading us to Cold War. And, I don't know, I think it'd be interesting to do a real study of the Belt and Road Initiative by China and the kind of measures that are part of those investments, and with sort of, US, and Wall Street debt and World Bank and IMF kind of programs and stuff like that. I would think it doesn't compare, that the West and the US and Wall Street are way more, egregious in the conditions than anything that's happening by other sort of investors and systems. So, but I'm curious, I don't know, Sophia, if you have any data on that. It's just something generally would be good for us, I think, to look at.
No, I mean, I totally agree. I don't have data on that. My sense is the same as yours. And I mean, I have seen like maps of other militaries and their bases, and it's amazing to look at because there's barely any. There's nothing like this map that I showed you that has, 800 bases across the world. So if we're talking specifically about like using international debt to, strong arm like a military base or military presence somewhere, that's is not happening simply because there's not a lot of foreign military presence in the world aside from the United States.
Sophia, I was wondering if when you were talking to either active or soldiers or veterans, if you came across another type of debt where people, especially in the case of immigrants, where they would say, well, we owe the US something. And so there's this weird ideology at work, or other folks, not just immigrants, even saying, well, we owe the United States. Because I think it's interesting to think through the different registers of debt, and that, not just financial. And the way that also plays into specifically, I think, war. I've read cases of folks, coming out of different wars, and then even their children saying, well, we owe it to our parents to fight in the next war. And I think there was a big case in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of volunteer soldiers. But yeah, did you come across that other type of register of debt, not just the financial debt, and how that might have impacted people?
Yeah, no, totally. And I should have included it in my presentation because it's so important. So I appreciate you bringing that up. There's so much discourse of debt around immigrants, period, right? Immigrants are forever owing America this and that, right? They're just in perpetual debt. And the subtitle of my book is Between Model Immigrant and Security Threat, because immigrants in the military are often pointed to as the best kind of immigrant. Like, look, they're not even US citizens yet. They have not been born in the US, but they're repaying their debt. This is the best way to repay that debt all you people have. So absolutely, there's that there's powerful narrative that's out there, and some immigrants will say things like that. Not a lot, Jason. Like just a few that I came across would talk in those terms, and there's some interesting twists to it, like with the intergenerational stuff. Like, for example, I had one participant that I interviewed who talked about like his Korean grandparents felt a debt to the United States from the Korean War, which is, I will also say there were many others who did not feel that way, but like that exists too. Of course, there were also like people whose grandparents were in the People's Republic of China who were horrified their grandchildren did enlist in the US military, which is what like they remembered fighting against, like literally. But yeah, I think it's really important to like connect this story of all the different types of debts in the military, also to kind of the discursive debt that immigrants are forever in. They can't ever repay, maybe by dying at war.
Yeah.
And then I will say one more thing because it pisses me off, because I remember after 2003, I was in grad school and I had liberal professors who were like immigrant rights advocates. And I remember them printing the names of soldiers that were like the first soldiers that had been killed, the US soldiers, and like pointing out like how many of them had immigrant names as proof that like immigration is good. And I just remember just being just really incensed by it. So I felt like I should share it with you. Sorry, digress.
Other questions or comments? I do want to ask Sophia, and please, anyone else, feel free to comment or question. Given all of this, Debt Collective is an organization we try and organize and bring together debtors who are spread out and collectivize power. Do you think this is an opening for Debt Collective or other groups to organize active or veteran military members around the issue of debt? Or is that just dangerous and foolish, and we would basically mark the end of our organization if we tried to intervene in that area of life?
I mean, what do folks think? I think that's a great practical question for us to think about, given the discussion today.
Yeah, and thank you for putting. I think anyone. What do other people think about this? Given what we heard, and Eric, thanks for joining us, even if it was a little bit late. It was a fantastic presentation. We'll make it public later. How do people feel about trying to organize veterans around this issue of the various types of debt that Sophia so elegantly and forcefully pointed out to us? Yeah, Dana, I don't know if you want to say something more about your comment. Phil, if you want to comment. Either or.
Well, I forwarded the event tonight to a friend I have who's the leader of Common Defense, which is one of the large, I think, progressive veterans groups in the country. And he said he'd heard you talk recently on a podcast or some sort of program with Mary Harris, What's Next maybe, and was planning on buying the book and reaching out to talk with you. So I think that's some indication maybe of some potential there. I saw him recently at the Poor People's Campaign Congress that happened a few weeks ago, and asked him about that. And he definitely agreed it was an issue that veterans were facing. But anyway, I guess that's a heads up to you that there's possibly some contact from Common Defense to you, Sophia.
Oh, thanks so much, Phil. Yeah.
Yeah, and we should be in touch with him as well around
Mhm.
this kind of organizing as debt collective. So.
Dana, do you want to add to the comment you put in the chat about some of the folks you've met at different events? And yeah.
I mean, it's hard to say. Sophia's the one who's talked to, these people way more than I have. But, at one conference, there was, and this was at an education conference, but there was a group of, anti-war, anti-imperialist veterans who were essentially, presenting on how, this is like 10 years ago, so I'm trying to remember, they're presenting on like how they post enlistment, kind of found critical pedagogy and kind of transitioned out of, their traditional way of thinking about life in the military. So I'm not sure if that's like a common experience, but it exists, which I guess is helpful to know. But if it is about political education, we're like, folks who are advocating for debt organizing would be like years behind, right? Like we'd have to like overcome a lot of education that's been going on in their lives, well before we showed up. So.
Sophia, do you have thoughts on this about whether or not you think this is kind of an issue that might help us mobilize and organize veterans, the debt issue, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if like we could test the waters with a particular type of debt. And there obviously may need to choose from as part of my presentation. But like if we looked at the medical debt, for example, that might be a promising way to test the waters. I mean, I think, and folks are on stack who probably have smarter things to say. I also, I'm thinking about the way that because of the hegemonic militarism in U.S. society, like military is really held apart as this like institution, and like rules don't apply that apply to the rest of the world. And then a lot of military workers also like replicate that way of thinking. And so you see a lot of like, well, I should not have debt because I serve my country, but the rest of you should. So like, I wonder if that is, it feels like that's going to be an obstacle to overcome in like building bridges across members of the military and those who are civilians.
Manny, you were on stack, and then maybe we turn it over to Sophia for last word, and we sign off.
Yeah, no, I was actually, to your last point, I was actually going to go and saying the same thing. I was like, I'm wondering if that would work, just because in my experience with like both being a mixed immigrant status family and the community I'm from, like there's this weird like patriotism that comes with being in the military. Like for me, the only reason the military was never an answer for me was because my dad was forcefully conscripted in the Salvadoran like army. And that's his whole thing was you're never going to the military. But then I have uncles and cousins who are like active, like I was a Marine in the military, but now they have mental health problems. So it's just like that's for me something I'm always battling with. So I'm just wondering like how you would think of like bridging that gap there. I mean, and that's literally I think the point you just made.
But I can end on a hopeful note. How about that?
Please
like-
end on a hopeful note.
Like one thing that I find really inspiring and that I learned a ton about is something that, Dana, you already brought up is, people really change and like, really change how they think about the military and their role in it in tremendous ways. And also there's a tremendous political diversity within like the military and military workers. And I think it's not obvious to a lot of people, like I've had, people say like, well, veterans think this. Well, it is just not true that there is a lot of like different types of politics that people hold who have been connected to the military in different ways, and people change tremendously like throughout their lives, not everybody. And so like having like talked to people who have undergone these transformations and reading about them and thinking about people like Camilo Mejia, who was, the first person to resist being deployed to Iraq. And he was an immigrant who was like, when he enlisted as a teenager, he was like gung-ho, like America. And, 10 years later, he was serving a year in the military prison. And he was the first to do so. And, natural citizenship is cut off for him now because of that. I mean, that's kind of what I think when I think about the possibilities there of that collective's work. And, I'll stop there. I'm trailing off.
Hope dies last, so I appreciate that. I'm going to put one. Sorry about that. I was muted. I'm going to put one more time in the chat where we can buy Sofya's excellent book. Sofya, thank you so much once more for giving us so much to think about on many different levels. It seems to be all sorts of stones that we have to unturn here to try and dig ourselves out of this issue or the issues that you brought up. And thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We have another military, or rather war and debt discussion as part of this series on war and debt from Nazia Kazi, who will be talking about Islamophobia, militarism, education, and the debt trap. Nazia is also a brilliant scholar activist, so please, if you can, try and turn out for that, invite your friends, and stay tuned for other Jubilee School events. We are trying to slowly but surely develop the analysis and the actions that'll help us abolish all the different types of debt that Sofya brought up today, and hopefully in the process also racial, colonial, imperial capitalism. So thank you so much, Sofya. Thank you everyone for coming out, and stay strong, stay in the struggle.
Thanks, everybody. Good
Take care.
night.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.